Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Finance Minister, particularly for the acknowledgement towards the Workers' Party of coming up with alternative revenue proposals for the government's consideration. And we did so, of course, knowing that since the introduction of, or the decision to raise GST was announced a few years ago, circumstances have changed. COVID wasn't anticipated, of course. And of course, core inflation right now is at its highest level in 9 years. I think the prices of goods and services is not a point I need to repeat. Minister would know, thanks to CPI information from MAS and MTI, that price pressures will impact Singaporeans, particularly at the low and middle income levels. This is even as the question is important as to raising the GST at this time. Minister made some brief points about it. He had thought about it carefully. But I think the question remains, is this a reasonable thing to do in these circumstances? That's the first question. And the point, I think, arises more acutely when you take into account what market watchers have said about BEPS 2.0, which may well result in corporate tax revenue gains for Singapore. And I think this is a point that has been raised at the start of the week, coinciding with this budget debate. To that end, my first question is, can I ask, what is the government's current estimates, given that there is an implementation deadline of 2023 for BEPS? What is the range of estimates of the net impact of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 on our corporate income tax revenues? I mean, surely the MOF would have prepared itself for these various scenarios. And can I confirm that the MOF does not have these various scenarios planned out? And this really comes up and brings up the other point Minister raised about red herrings, and that somehow when the opposition asks for questions about revenue and expenditure projections, these are red herrings. But it can't be so, because as I mentioned in my budget speech, it's something that many jurisdictions do. I mean, Hong Kong has a medium-range forecast right up to fiscal year 2026, 2027. And they've got assumptions. Of course, you're projecting into the future, so it can't be perfect. And I think people will give the government buffer and leeway for that. But that's incredibly important. And that's precisely why the Workers' Party put forward different revenue streams. Now, Minister rounded off at the end about the importance of information, facts. I completely agree with him. But wouldn't this approach not to make a call for information characterizing it as a red herring, but actually just producing that information, lead to the outcome that the minister himself speaks of, and reduces the prospect of individuals mischaracterizing positions, which one could argue has also been done in the course of this debate. I think there were arguments made in the extreme which were not put forward by WP MPs. I don't think anybody suggested raising personal income tax for the upper tier up to 42% to make up for the GST hole. And that wasn't done. But it was nonetheless characterized as an opposition idea. So I think it's a case of what is good for the goose must be good for the gander. And this is something I hope that can be actually alleviated through more projections, what the government needs, how much it's going to collect, because this will result in a more fruitful debate. In the course of my budget speech, I did make a point about the revenue that the carbon tax will bring in. I hear the minister's point. He said it in the beginning of he said it when he opened the debate. He's saying it now. He doesn't expect carbon tax to bring in new sources of revenue, but still a debate has to be had. What are those numbers? Particularly when you look at utility prices, utility bills for average Singaporeans, which the minister says in his speech are going up. I believe he used a 25-year timeline, but if you follow it in a linear fashion, that's $12 by 2030, an increase. So those numbers should really be brought forward by the government so that we can debate these and talk about whether our people, both at the low and middle income levels, can be supported in a better way. I think Minister raised a number of points. We spoke about the various levers. The other WP MPs, of course, will chip in and make those clarifications with the Minister. But Mr. Chua is not here today. He would be happy to come into this debate, I can assure you. But he is self-isolating just to be on the more safe side. He's not, I think he was positive yesterday, but then it came out to be a negative. So I think better for him to stay away. But he will definitely come back to this in the course of what happens with BEPS and actually what are those projections that the government is working with vis-a-vis its impact. Number of other points, like I said, I'll let the other WP MPs come in, but I think there's a useful question to ask about the reserves. We've had this exchange in this House a number of times on our position on the reserves. I don't think it's an allusion to it's an accurate reflection to say that first instance you look and turn to the reserves. That's not true. And we've really made the government's own approach informed in this House as to how it also takes a certain approach to change how it deals with its reserves mechanism at quite short intervals. 2008, 2015, we're entering a decade where circumstances are changing quite significantly. Minister himself recognized in his budget speech that I believe there's a review of even healthcare resourcing. Para 239, we are thinking through this healthier SG strategy carefully. It will entail a review of our resourcing approach and healthcare financing schemes, as well as the need for upstream investments in preventive healthcare. So clearly the other numbers that were in his speech about potentially where we could be with healthcare expenditure if we don't keep it in check may not really be what will eventually be the outcome, because there is a review going on.
Mr. Singh, this part is really for clarifications. I will allow preamble, and as leader of opposition, I'm prepared to allow you some leeway, but let's keep to the point.
Mr. Speaker, I take the point. I will.
Before I end, just a reminder to the rest of the members, this is meant for clarification. So if you have some preamble, I'll allow it, but please limit the time. Thank you.
Obliged, Speaker. I will not abuse this. Let me just then come to the point about, before I hand it over to the other colleagues of mine to make clarifications. It was previously said, and the Minister alluded to this, I beg your pardon, the Minister didn't allude to this. It was previously said that we have drawn on our reserves equivalent to 20 years of past budget surpluses. This was a government position vis-a-vis COVID. We've used a generation's worth of savings to combat a crisis of a generation. My colleague Louis Chua asked DPM Heng in his capacity as finance minister previously, after accounting for the draw, where would our reserves be compared to 5 years ago and 10 years ago? And he made the point that this really wasn't answered. And he put the question to the finance minister, Minister Wong, and after having a better fix on the number, 42.9 billion drawn on past reserves, where would our reserves be today as compared to 5 years ago? Is it higher or is it lower? I think that's a question that can be answered in one word. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So I thank the Leader of the Opposition for these comments and questions. There are a few of them, and I will take them in turn. First, on the increase of GST. It is a very difficult decision. It was a very difficult decision for all the reasons I've explained. Recognizing on the one hand the concerns that Singaporeans have about higher prices, but on the other hand, the urgent and very pressing revenue needs we have to address. And that's why I highlighted that I decided eventually to delay the GST and to stagger the increase over 2 years. I suppose Mr. Singh's point is that even that is not enough. And I can understand that some people might feel and be concerned that even that delay and that staggering is not sufficient to address concerns, especially in light of the recent developments in the external environment. And that's why I mentioned just now that the best way to deal with this is, number one, if indeed inflation turns out to be more persistent and higher than expected, which may happen, we will deal with that decisively and separately, and we have the tools and resources to do so. How? Well, we have monetary policy to deal with inflation. We are able to take a series of actions to better secure our energy supplies. And thirdly, we can help households and businesses directly. We have the resources to do so. And if the need arises, we will not hesitate to take all of these actions. So that's one first assurance we have for everyone. The second assurance is that even setting aside additional measures and actions, we have already done a lot, and I've been trying to explain that. Look at the significant help that's on the table today. Household support package this year, plus assurance package and the GST vouchers, both of which have been enhanced, combined together, and both being rolled out this year before the GST goes up. A lot of help which will, for most households, delay the impact of the GST increase by 5 years or more. 5 years or more. So the two taken together, I think, should assure everyone that we are not doing this in a cavalier manner at all. We considered it very, very carefully before we decided to proceed, and making sure that we are taking all the necessary actions and steps and have contingency measures in place to take care of the concerns of every Singaporean. That's number one. On two, on projections and numbers and data, I accept Mr. Singh's point. I was not attempting to characterize it unfairly. I was just sharing my feelings about these repeated requests for information as perhaps distracting us from the real issues. But I accept Mr. Singh's clarification, and I assure him, you have my commitment that we will continue to put out more information as much as possible in order to provide for more informed debates. And I hope he also takes what he said seriously, that the opposition will also exercise leeway in recognizing that these projections in the outer years are inherently fraught with a great deal of uncertainty, especially for a small, little open economy like Singapore, where so many external events can never be predicted with any degree of certainty. So very often, we don't even project GDP beyond a year. Right? So when you talk about outer year projections for the economy, for fiscal projections, there will be a very high cone of uncertainty around these numbers. And we therefore want to make sure that if we were to provide any figures, we do not inadvertently mislead people, cause people to have the wrong impression. And I seek the leader of the opposition's understanding too, that in putting out such figures in the future, we may very well get it wrong, because there is a lot of uncertainty when we project into the outer years. But you have my commitment that we will continue to see how we can improve the data and information that we put out. Thirdly, on the reserves, I've explained our position and why changes in the rules done hastily, we think, are not wise, are not prudent, and will come at the detriment of the next generation. If we have to change any rules, we will have to seriously consider them very, very carefully. But if we make any tweaks in parameters, more land sales, more NRIC now, what it basically means in the end, at the end of the day, is that our future generations will be the ones to have to carry the burden. They will have to pay more in taxes in the future. That's what it comes down to. And they will have that much less to deal with any future emergencies, which we all know will come at a more frequent rate in the coming years. So all I say is let's have a care about this, and I do not think it's prudent to make this change now in place of raising the GST or other tax changes which we can and should do. As for the quantum of reserves, I have actually mentioned that in my speech. I said that our reserves are growing. We won't be able to tell you what the actual figure is for the reasons I've explained. It's not in our national interest. But as I said in my speech, our reserves are growing. But our economy, our needs, the complexity of our needs, and the magnitude of the challenges we face are growing even faster. And what's more important when you drill it down is, are we accumulating more than necessary? And the answer is no. How do we know that this is the case? Because our NIRC, as I mentioned before, we project will continue to grow at a rate that keeps pace with economic growth. That's how we know that we are not over-accumulating. Whatever we are getting from NIRC today at 3.5% of GDP on average over the past few years, we do not expect that to continue rising as a share of GDP. It will keep pace with economic growth. And as I mentioned in my speech, even doing that, we cannot be sure that we can achieve that. But if we are able to do so, it will already be a significant achievement because of all the headwinds that we are facing in the global investment environment. I think I've answered all the questions from Mr. Singh, sir.
Mr. Singh?
Oh, sorry, one more question. BEPS. Yeah. BEPS, the short answer is, again, this is one of those things where it's not, we have been studying this very carefully. And as I mentioned just now on Pillar 1, the rules are still being fine-tuned. It's not over yet. It's still being discussed. Yes, there is the pronouncement of 2023, but I don't know for a fact that this will happen in 2023 because many details are still being worked out. So that's one of the reasons why I mentioned I hesitate to put out any figures at this stage, but taking the earlier point about putting out more information for a more informed debate, we will go back and think about whether we might provide a range of estimates about what the impact of BEPS 2.0 might be for both Pillars 1 and Pillars 2. I would say it would range from neutral to perhaps some increase, but we'll have to look at the figures. And we will provide some figures, hopefully, to help everyone get a better sense of what it might be. But what's more important, especially the point I mentioned, which is that even if Pillars 1 and Pillars 2 combined yield us additional revenue, we will very likely have to reinvest that revenue back into ensuring we remain competitive and attract our fair share of investments. Why? Because the reality is competition for investments is not going to go away just because of BEPS 2.0. In fact, it will get even more intense. And it will intensify in other areas, in other non-tax areas, which we will therefore have to fund and have resources ready for. So even if there is a plus from BEPS 2.0, I am in fact not confident that that additional revenue will help us with our social spending needs, and especially not for our healthcare spending needs, which will continue to rise very sharply.
Mr. Singh?
Thank you, Minister, for the reply. I think it just reinforces the point that I've been trying to make about the alternative revenue streams that the Workers' Party came up with in the course of this debate, knowing that there are quite fundamental changes taking place worldwide where we need a better fix on what the revenue situation will be. I think Minister missed out one point, one question that I also put in my speech about the carbon tax and the estimates that the government has with its increase at the tiers up to 2030. I think those numbers would be appreciated, even though I take Minister's point, as I mentioned in my earlier clarification, that he doesn't foresee this to be a revenue generator, if I can put it that way. But I think this is something that we should have a debate about in good time.
Mr. Leong Man Wai?
Thank you, Speaker. We won't be having such a difficult debate if Singaporeans, especially the middle class Singaporeans, are not asked to pay more taxes. So I have two questions first for clarification. I have a total of about 6 questions. I hope the Speaker will allow me to ask all the 6 questions, but let me ask 2 questions first. I have given a number of the tax burden of the GST on the middle class to be $1.2 billion. So take away all the compensating packages that you are going to give them. Divide the taxpayers into 3 groups. Top 20%, the middle class who will not get permanent vouchers, and those taxpayers who will get permanent vouchers, how is the $3 billion or $3.5 billion additional GST is going to spread over these 3 groups? First, question 1. Question 2, PSP hasn't been talking a lot about alternative sources of revenue because we think there is a lot of justification to make use of the unutilized revenues. But if you look at alternative avenues, actually it's very easy from our point of view. Second question, if you have to choose between a 2% GST hike and a 3 to 4% personal income tax hike on the top 10%, they will yield about the same amount of revenue. Would you still choose the GST 2% hike? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, let me answer the second question first, because it's quite straightforward. The sums don't add up, Mr. Leong. The sums don't add up. A 2 to 3% percentage point increase in the top personal income tax rate will never get anywhere close to the revenue we get from a 2% increase in GST. It will not. So there's no choice here, right? In fact, we are already raising the personal income tax rates in this budget. We get some money from it, but it's not enough, and that's why the GST increase is needed. But as I've repeatedly said, the objections to GST on the basis that it hurts the poor are completely unfounded. You may disagree with the GST, fine, but do not use that as a reason for disagreeing with GST. There's no basis for that in Singapore. So stop pretending that this is the reason. On the first question, impact of the middle class, I know what you're trying to do with your computations, but I have shown in my chart and in my speech a different way of showing it, which is the share of GST paid by the different groups. And you can see from that, the chart is self-explanatory. The middle 20%, the share burden that they pay for GST, the increase in GST comes down, right? So effectively what it means is that the increase in GST, the $3.5 billion of revenues that GST generates, that 2% of GST generates, will be borne by the upper middle and the top income earners. That's what it comes down to. It shows in that effective rate chart where you saw when we stacked up the effective GST rates and we showed the increase in GST to 9%, that extra burden is all borne by the upper income deciles, upper middle and top end. And that's exactly how we have designed the system. It is that group that will bear the burden of the GST increase, while the rest of the population pay the GST rate, but the impact of GST expenses are offset on a continuing basis. And that's why we can have the confidence of implementing a consumption tax in Singapore that is fair, that is effective, and doesn't hurt the poor.
Mr. Leong Mawai.
Speaker, thank you. Minister, I think you didn't answer my question. After all, someone have to pay for the $3 billion or $3.5 billion GST. So I'm asking you, what is the tax burden on the different groups of Singaporeans? You cannot say there's no increase in tax burden. Secondly, on the income tax, can I ask the minister then, what is the total taxable income attributable to the top 10%? I can tell you that 4%, 3% increase in the income tax on the top 10% will yield $3 billion. What is the total taxable income? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Leong and Mr. Speaker, beg your pardon, I have to differ with Mr. Leong. I do not intend to get into a debate on figures with him. If he thinks that me and all my MOF officers know less about revenues than him, that's his, you're entitled to take that view. I do not wish to entertain or continue the debate further when we are not even able to, and if you are unable to accept facts which I have put out, and you say that that's wrong, I don't know how to debate any further. Because then what are we debating about? You are unable even to accept an authoritative fact from the Minister of Finance, and you say it's wrong. So what's the point of continuing the debate on facts and data if you do not accept the figures which I've put out on the personal income tax? I've already explained that it does not yield that figure. Just look at the revenue generated from the tax change we have just introduced in this budget. It's nowhere in the region of billions, nowhere. So I can only say the facts that you have are wrong, and it should not form the basis for public policy. On the first question, I've in fact answered it. I did not say that there's no increase in burden. Please do not distort what I said. Listen to what I said carefully. I said the burden is borne by the upper middle and top end, and it's reflected in the chart, and we will be able to circulate the chart after this, put it out on the website, and Mr. Leong can have all the time in the world to analyze the figures and internalize them. Thank you, sir.
Associate Professor James Lim.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his stout and robust defense of the need to raise GST. I have three clarification questions with regard to three separate areas. The first has to do with corporate taxation, and the question is whether the government plans to subscribe to the spirit of the BEPS agreement as a signatory and to roll out, broadly speaking, the framework as prescribed. And I mention this in part because the Workers' Party's proposal for corporate taxation is quite different from the hypothetical.
If we can just keep it to largely clarifications, like
sure.
I'll allow some preamble, but not another speech again.
Fair enough. So that was my first question. My second question has to do with wealth taxation. And the question is whether the Minister believes that the modest increase in wealth taxation that is set forth in our proposal, which is broadly consistent with, in fact, it significantly is lower than some other neutral analysts have had. Our estimate is 1.2 billion. Whether he thinks that this modest increase in wealth taxation will be such that it's will make Singapore so unattractive that high net worth individuals would relocate and be footloose in that sense. My third question has to do with land sales. And I accept the position that this government has, that they treat land sales as part of reserves. But then I'm wondering if he is able to reconcile the treatment of land sales that is less than 10 years, so land leases that are of 1 to 9 years, with the broad argument that land sales must all immediately go into reserves rather than take the first 9 years as part of recurrent revenue. Thank you.
So on the three questions, first on the BEPS 2.0, we are certainly committed to implementing the spirit of BEPS 2.0. We will do so while ensuring that this is indeed implemented around the world, because our bigger concern is that it must be a level playing field. It cannot be that some countries do it and others don't, and then there are leakages, revenue leakages, that will undermine Singapore. So we are watching. Yes, countries have signed up to it, but countries have to go through their own domestic processes to roll out BEPS 2.0. It's not a certainty that this will get through their respective parliaments. So signing the declaration is one thing, 2023, but will it get through all the countries' parliaments, legislations, and implemented in law? Not so sure yet. So we do want to make sure that there is a level playing field, and we will do our part as a signatory, as a responsible member of the international community, to likewise implement when there is that global consensus and global implementation. On wealth taxes, I recognize a proposal from Associate Professor Lim and the Workers' Party for a net wealth tax that will yield revenue of $1.2 billion. I have explained that it is, yes, in theory, you could design a scheme like that. You could. But in practice, it will be much more complicated. And it's not just about the fears of people leaving, but the fact that there are so many ways for high net worth individuals to circumvent whatever taxation rules you have in place and to plan away the burden of the wealth tax on themselves. The ones who do are usually the ones with better means, higher wealth. And this is why even in Switzerland, for example, if you look at the net wealth tax they have there, the burden of tax falls on a much broader base of the population. The so-called net wealth tax in Switzerland, it's not a wealth tax for the top end only. Many middle class, many middle income people pay for that net wealth tax. This was our experience in estate duty, mind you. As I mentioned, the top end, the very wealthy, knew how to plan it away, but the burden ended up falling on the middle income and the upper middle income. That's our bigger concern. And that's why, on top of the concern that, yes, there will be some competitiveness reasons, that's also a relevant concern. And that's why we have to study this very carefully. We have to think through, look at the experiences of other jurisdictions. Not very many left to study because, as I said, many of them have dropped the idea of doing a net wealth tax, and we will have to consider what is suitable for Singapore. So we will not rule it out, but at this stage, we do not have something that we are confident can be effectively implemented, suited to Singapore's circumstances. On land sales, the easy answer is for these shorter duration leases, we've decided for flexibility, and because there are more transactions like that, there is no need to regard them as assets, and therefore we take them in as current revenue. But for the ones with longer leases, we treat them as assets, and then therefore we take them into our reserves framework and accord the treatment accordingly. It's a judgment call. We could have said everything, regardless of the duration of the lease, but we have worked out what we think is a reasonable balance, and that has been decided and agreed with the President's office.
So Gerald Giam.
So the minister accused WP of double standards by calling for higher taxes on tobacco because that is regressive. But would he not agree that more taxes on tobacco and gambling are acceptable if they can help discourage that behavior, because the effects of that behavior have far higher health and family costs on the low income and therefore are more regressive? Secondly, the minister said that those with fewer means will bear a lighter share of the GST increase. But they get more benefits from the government and more than what they put in. This is what he said just now in his speech. He said this makes a fair and inclusive system. And he repeated that point in his Chinese speech as well. And he just said just now that the burden is all borne by the upper middle and the top deciles of income earners. Sir, if those with fewer means really get back more than what they pay, by the minister's logic, how will they feel that they are contributing? And to be clear, WP is not against the lower income getting back more if this is indeed the case. But can the minister clarify whether or not the GST hike will make the lower and middle income pay more in net taxes over a 20 or 30-year period?
Sir, I did not say that I was opposed to sin taxes or to tobacco taxes. I was simply highlighting that the Workers' Party made a big issue of regressivity in one case, but not in another case. So I didn't understand why there was inconsistency there. But we have never made a big issue of it. And in fact, we don't look at fiscal systems like that. As I said, it's not appropriate to consider item by item. We look at the system as a whole. And where sin taxes are concerned, externality tax, we do it not for revenue generating purposes. Yes, it generates some, but not a lot, but really more for curbing consumption, which we think is necessary. And that's why we will continue to review these taxes from time to time, as we have been doing. On the second point, the burden of GST increase and how our system works, I think Mr. Jalagiam is saying, well, you want everyone to contribute, but with GST, the low income don't end up paying net, they don't have to pay, so how do they contribute? But the point is this, with the GST, yes, they may get back something in terms of continuing offsets, but they do pay. There is a price. If there were no price to pay, we would not be having this debate. Everyone will happily say GST goes up, and there is no opposition to it. But I think the Workers' Party and the PSP know that this is something not very popular on the ground, and therefore they are objecting to it. But because people have to pay for it, then they feel that they are contributing to the system. Everyone contributes. With GST, we bring that about. It's a broad-based consumption tax which impacts everyone, and everyone feels it, but it's also the way they can contribute and chip into the system. But what we have done is do it in a fair way by offsetting the impact. And because the GST vouchers are permanent, they are conjoined with our GST system. It's together, permanent. Therefore, we have confidence to say that on a continuing basis, the charts that I've described, how we can offset the impact on the low-income groups, that is something we can do not just today, not just 5 years, but on a continuing basis.
Just a reminder to members, you do know that we have a committee of supply coming up where the specific and technical questions can be asked, so we can keep our focus on the overall fiscal policy of the government. Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Finance Minister for his wrap-up speech. I have 3 clarifications. Before that, just a very short sort of a response or preamble. I think the Minister talked about how much the PIT, the personal income tax, would have to rise, or the property tax would have to rise to fill the hole if GST was not hiked. So I want to clarify that when my colleague, Professor Lim, outlined different proposals for revenue generation, that was never the intent, that the entire burden of plugging that hole fall onto personal income tax or onto property tax. So, with respect, I think the view that we are putting forth proposals that soak the rich is a mischaracterization. In fact, it's a caricaturization of what we have put forward. The bulk of revenue generation in those proposals actually fell on the changes to the land sales, the changes to the NIRC, and also the net effect on corporate tax take from compliance with the BEPS regime, not a discretionary increase in corporate tax, but how that would impact the overall corporate tax take. And I think our point there is that...
Mr. Pereira, if we can come to your clarifications and questions, please.
All right. Let me move to my first clarification, which is I had an exchange with the Honourable Minister, Mr. Lawrence Wong, in this House in 2018, And I asked the minister at that time, what would be a reasonable time interval, when we review these rules governing the reserves? They were amended in 2008, they were amended again in 2015. So what is a reasonable time interval? Are we saying that, it is set in stone and we never amend it? And the Honourable Minister's reply to me at that time was, you never say never. And these things do have to be reviewed at a certain point. So my question is, what does the minister think is a reasonable point in time when we review these rules as we've suggested? The second clarification is on the concept of an optimal level of reserves. I would invite the minister to agree with me that as the absolute level of reserves increases in dollar terms as a proportion of GDP, we must accept that it is legitimate to bring into place policies that slow the growth of that reserve without depleting it. And on that note, would it be the case that the minister rejects altogether any notion that there's an optimal level of reserves and we keep adding to the reserves ad infinitum without any regard to the absolute level and its relation to GDP? The last clarification is the minister alluded to the fact that when we make suggestions about the reserves, about land sales, about NIRC, there's a certain sort of a cavalier mindset involved in doing so. I'd like to ask him, the PAP government in this House did exactly that in 2008, and they did it again in 2015. Was that cavalier? And if that wasn't cavalier, why is it cavalier when the Workers' Party now suggests doing that? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on the 3 points, the first, I recognize that the Workers' Party suggestions for revenue alternatives could entail mix and matches, as they have highlighted, a bit from here, a bit from there. But I still say, as I have highlighted, the sums will not add up. Why? Basically, you are asking to tax more from 3 possible groups as an alternative to GST. The wealthy, the better off, large companies, and future generations. So that's what it comes down to. The future generations would mean land sales, NIRC, these sorts of changes, and I've explained why we do not think it is financially prudent to make those changes. Large companies, I have highlighted, this is contingent on the evolving rules around BEPS 2.0, and even if we were to get some additional revenue, we are very likely to have to reinvest back to strengthen our competitiveness. Leaves me with the third group, wealthy. And that means wealth taxes, which I've explained can be difficult to do, or property tax, or personal income tax. And if you were to go home in on property tax, I've explained how if you want to get another $1 billion of revenue from property tax, you have to literally you probably will have to double property tax rates across the board. That's just 1 billion. GST is 3.5 billion. So where does the money come from? And that's why I highlighted the sums still do not add up. I appreciate these, take it in good faith that there are these different options that the Workers' Party has offered as alternatives. We've studied all of them before the budget. During the budget debate, when these options were raised, we went into them again with my team, but we still are not able to make the sums add up. The next 2 questions, I will take them together. When it's the next reasonable interval where we might review our reserves rules, is there an optimal level of reserves? It's very hard to answer these questions because I don't have a crystal ball, and really, who knows what will happen to the world in the next 30 years or more? Really, can anybody predict? It's almost impossible. So what will trigger us to change? I think it will have to be something really very disruptive, not just once off, but on a permanent basis, and we'll have to study the options very, very carefully at that point in time because there are deep, deep implications if we were to change anything on the reserves rules. Deep implications for intergenerational equity, essentially resulting in our next generation having to pay more taxes, as I said, and having less to deal with any emergencies in the future. And that's why I would say not something we do today, because we have other options. We have the GST, which we can implement in a fair way. We have other tax options. And that is the reason why I ask, and I said, I wonder, maybe this is taking it a little bit too lightly, because why turn to the reserves when we have all these options, and why make the GST into the last resort? But reserves, okay. Future generations, never mind, let's do it. But GST cannot touch. Why? Why take that approach? Especially when the way we have implemented the GST is not the way the Workers' Party has characterized it. It is not. And you know it too. I've shown the charts. I've explained it. We have explained it before in multiple times, and we have reiterated our explanation. So if you understand this, then why are your proposals anything but GST increase? Even reserves can be touched, but not GST increase. That part, honestly, I can't understand. And it makes me wonder why, the Workers' Party cites the excuse that, or cites that the GST increase will hurt the poor. It doesn't. I've explained it. And on that basis, they say they cannot support the budget. But really, you know what you are saying then? You don't want to support all the things we have in this budget to uplift the wages of lower income workers, work fair, progressive wages, to help vulnerable families with Kickstart. You are rejecting all of that. I find it hard to understand, frankly, on the misguided view that GST hurts the poor, which it doesn't. And I can only, therefore, ask whether you are taking things too lightly or whether you are raising this in opposition because of other reasons, political reasons, or other things, as opposed to seriously looking at the facts and doing what's right for Singapore. I mean, the Workers' Party is entitled to their views and to, not supporting the budget, but it will not stop me as Finance Minister from doing what is right, and it will not stop this government from continuing with all our efforts to build a better Singapore.
Ms. Hazel Pua, it's time for one clarification from you.
I would like to ask, just now the Finance Minister responded to my question about the budget cut. I did not just ask about the 1% cut, which is meant for to start next year, but also the 2% budget cut that was supposed to have been implemented from FY 2017. Can I take it that the same reason applies, that it was not really a cut but was reallocated to new initiatives, and that therefore this is a reallocation, not strictly a budget cut? And that does the new initiative therefore include the subsidy to the F1 as well as the transfer to SPH Media Trust?
Mr. Speaker, yes, Ms. Pua is right that when we talked about these budget cuts, they are in the context of a budgetary framework that allows us to reduce. So the cuts are real, mind you. The cuts are real and actually apply to ministry expenditures. But Singapore also has new priorities, and therefore this allows us to reallocate expenditure from existing to new without having to just top up more monies. And in this way, we can moderate the increases in expenditures. On how these, what are the areas these reallocated monies go to, and whether the SPH Media Trust and F1 are part of it, I think we can discuss all this in the respective ministry COSs when they come up. Thank you, sir.
Question is that Parliament approves the financial policy of the government for the financial year 1st April 2022 to 31st March 2023. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Workers' Party would like to record its dissent, please. Thank you. No offset package lasts forever.
Would the members who like to
Speaker.
record dissent, please stand up for record.
Speaker, sir,
Mr. Leong, we're taking a record of dissent.
before we do that,
Mr. Leong, we're taking a record for dissent. If you have other clarifications, you can raise it during the Committee of Supply. Thank you. May I sit down?
Just a quick
Leader
one,
of
Mr.
Opposition.
Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chair Ms. Sylvia Lim, He Ting Ru, and MPs Louis Chua are not here because they are self-isolating.
Understand.
Just want to take that they take the same position as well. I just want.
They need to be in person to
I understand.
record.
I understand.
I may repeat from earlier. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.